Hey bag ladies and bag dudes, I'm Sarah Lawson from So Sweetness, and today I'm going to show you how to make the Oriole bag. The Oriole bag comes in two different sizes, large and small, and with the creative use of darts, it forms a three-dimensional shape. This bag also has an adjustable strap, and you can make it with either a traditional magnetic snap or with a twist lock, as I've done here. So grab your supplies and let's get started. Okay, before we begin cutting out fabric, you'll need to print out the PDF pattern, and the last 5 pages contain the templates that we'll need for the pattern pieces. So when printing out a pattern, you always want to open the file up in Adobe Reader. You don't want to open the pattern file up in a web browser, and you want to print at actual size, not scaling or fit to page. So on the 4th page of the templates, there's a 1-inch square and a 4-centimeter square. You want to measure either of those to make sure that they measure exact. So they shouldn't be slightly smaller or slightly larger. They need to measure exact. Okay, so let's go ahead and tape these together and cut all of the pieces out. So the first 4 pages are going to be taped together. I'm going to leave page 1 alone. Page 2, I'm going to cut along the left-hand margin. Okay, and then these get taped together along the solid triangles on the side of the page. Okay, and same thing for adding page 3. Again, I'm going to cut out along the left-hand margin. Okay, and one more page that needs to be taped. Page 4 also needs to be taped. Okay, so after you have pages 1 through 4 taped together, page 5 can be left untaped. You're going to cut all of the pattern pieces out along the outside of the thick black line. Okay, so this is what the pieces should look like once you've cut them out. 2 of them will be for large, so you'll need a flat piece for size large and a main panel for size large. Leave the dart alone for now. And there's also a flap for size small and a main panel for size small. So for this particular video, I'll be making size small, but the directions will be the same unless otherwise noted. Okay, so let me show you how to attach the fabric to the interfacing. So I've got my lining flap fabric right here. I'm going to flip to the wrong side of the fabric, and I'm going to take the Shape Flex interfacing, and the side that feels bumpy to your fingertips is the side that's going to go against the wrong side of the fabric. And I've got my iron set at the cotton setting, and I'm just going to glide the iron over each area of the interfacing for approximately 10 seconds. And you'll want to use your press cloth. For the videos, I don't use a press cloth, just so you can see exactly what I'm doing. And you can use some steam if you wish as well. Okay, when you feel like you've ironed it long enough, take one of the corners and try with your fingernail to peel back the interfacing from the fabric. If it doesn't peel away, that means you've ironed long enough. And if the interfacing comes away from the fabric, just iron it a little bit longer. Okay, and to attach the exterior fabric of the flap to the foam interfacing, if your foam is fusible, go ahead and fuse it in a similar manner as the Shape Flex interfacing. I like using by Annie Soft and Stable, which is a foam sew-in interfacing. So I'm just going to smooth the fabric on top of the foam and use some Wonder Clips to hold the layers in place. I'm going to machine baste the fabric to the foam along the entire outer edge using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And for any machine basting, I usually like to lengthen my stitch, so I'm going to lengthen to a 4mm stitch length. Okay, and you'll repeat this process for both of the exterior main panels and the foam interfacing as well. Okay, in order to make a longer strap piece out of cotton fabric, you'll be sewing the two short ends right sides together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then pressing that seam open before attaching to the Shape Flex interfacing. And one more thing to note before we get started, if you're installing your flap using a magnetic snap, you'll need one piece of Peltex or Decovil about a 1-inch square. And if you're using the twist lock, you'll need that 1-inch square as well, but in addition, you'll also need a 2-inch square of the Shape Flex interfacing, and for either of those options, the extra interfacing is just to reinforce the metal hardware. Okay, first we're going to make the lining pocket. So go ahead and pull out your pocket fabric, and we're going to flip so that the fabric is right sides together and the short ends meet. We're going to sew the top and the sides using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, except leave a little 3-inch opening along the top edge. We'll use that opening for turning right side out. Okay, you're going to take your scissors and you're just going to clip the corners, and that just helps the pocket look more crisp. And then reach through the opening and pull the fabrics so that they're wrong sides together. And I'm going to use this precision turning tool to poke out the corners. And I'm also going to slide the tool along the seam to make it easier for pressing. Okay, you'll also be pressing that opening toward the wrong side by a 1/4 inch. Okay, we're going to top stitch this edge with the opening using an 1/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, now pull out one of your lining main panels, and I'm going to take my paper pattern piece as well, just so that I can find the center point of that panel. And step number 5 tells you whether you're making small or large, how far down that pocket will be. So I'm making size small, so I'm going to measure down 2 3/4 inch from that top edge. And I'll make that mark along my center line. Okay, and I'm just going to use a bit of chalk to mark the center, and this is the Clover Choco. Okay, I'm going to finger press that pocket in half and keep it pressed in half, and I'm going to align it right at that marking that I made from the top edge, and then I can open it up and it's centered. So we're going to stitch the sides and the bottom of the pocket using an 1/8 inch seam. Okay, now it's time to cut the dart out of the paper pattern piece. I'm not going to cut all the way to the top. I'm going to leave maybe a 1/4 to 1/2 inch along the top just to keep the fabric together. So I'm going to snip my scissors right in the middle of the paper and then cut the rest of the dart out. Okay, now go ahead and pull out one of your main panels and flip to the wrong side of the fabric. And we're going to lay that pattern piece so that the top and side corners are aligned. Okay, first off, I'm going to draw a line right down the center. And then I'm also going to mark the dart. And you need to transfer the dart to the top as well, so I'm going to just make a marking connecting the two. And if you'd like, you can go ahead and use your ruler for that. And we'll mark the dart on the other half as well. Okay, and I'll use my ruler this time. You're just making a straight line. Okay, you'll repeat the same process with both of your lining main panels on the wrong side of the fabric and both of the exterior main panels as well. Okay, now we're going to pinch the dart legs, and these are the dart legs right here, so that the fabric is right sides together and that the lines are right on top of each other. Okay, so the lines are on top of each other, and I'm also going to orient it so that this point over here is right on the fold of the fabric. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing for the other dart as well. Again, pinching so that the fabrics are right sides together. The legs of the dart are on top of each other. And make sure that this point down here looks nice. Okay, I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew directly on top of the line on both halves of that lining main panel. Okay, we're going to trim the darts to approximately 1/4 of an inch, and there's no need to measure. You can just go ahead and eyeball it. Okay, and you'll repeat the same process for all of the lining main panels and all of the exterior main panels. So when you go to press these darts, for the lining main panels, we're going to press the seam toward the side of the panel. For the exterior fabric, however, you're going to press the seam toward the center because we want nesting seam. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now with the lining. Again, the lining is going to be pressed toward the side. Okay, and just repeat that for 2 of the lining main panels total and 2 of the exterior main panels total. Okay, now we're going to make the flap. So there's 2 options for the flap closure. There's either a magnetic snap, which looks like this, or a twist lock. So first I'm going to show you the magnetic snap. If you're not using the magnetic snap, obviously you'll skip to the next step. Okay, so go ahead and pull out your lining flap piece. And from the magnetic snap, you'll need the male half, which is the piece with the little nub. And if yours came with a washer, you'll need that washer, and go ahead and put the other half of the snap to the side. Okay, we're going to use the flap pattern piece to mark the center of the bag. And we're also going to mark 1 inch up from this bottom curved edge, and that's where we'll be installing the snap. Okay, so I'm just making a mark right there. If your magnetic snap did not come with a washer, you'll just use the prongs. So you'll center the magnetic snap over the mark that you made, and with your fabric marker, you'll just mark where the prongs are. Mine did come with a washer, so I'm going to center the center circle on the mark that I made and mark where the slits will be. And also, it's time to pull out your piece of Peltex or Decovil, whatever you're using, and mark the prongs on that piece as well. Okay, so you're going to take your seam ripper and mark the slits, and always start off with a smaller slit because you can always make a smaller slit bigger, but if you accidentally get too ambitious, you're kind of stuck with the bigger slits. Okay, so I'm just going to make the slits through the fabric, and then this is optional, but I always like to follow up any slits that I'm making through the fabric with a bit of seam sealant. And just put a little dab on there, and that just helps reinforce the fabric since you just cut into it. Okay, so that snap is going to go through the right side of the fabric. Flip to the wrong side, place that piece of Peltex on the prongs, and then follow it up with the washer if you have the washer. Okay, so I always like to use the side of a table to open those prongs outward. You can also use some snap pliers, but leaning the prongs up against the table make it really easy and saves your fingers from hurting them. Okay, let me slide this back over. So this is what it looks like from the right side of the fabric, and that's what it'll look like from the wrong side of the fabric. Okay, so that portion of the flap is finished if you're using the traditional magnetic snaps. If you are using the twist lock, either method will continue on. So both traditional magnetic snap and twist lock, this is the next step in the pattern. So you're going to pull out both of your flap pieces, place them right sides together, and then pin the sides and the bottom. We're going to be sewing the sides and the bottom using 1/4 inch seam allowance. And my regular stitch length is 2.5 millimeters, and that's what I have my sewing machine set at. Okay, we're going to leave a 5-inch opening on the straight edge, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave myself a bit of a reminder where I'm going to leave the opening, and we'll start sewing here and we'll stop sewing on the opposing end. Okay, now with your scissors, go ahead and clip the corners. And then we're going to notch the curved edges. So notching means cutting small V's approximately every 1/2 inch wherever there's a curve. And what that does is it helps spread the fabric apart so that when you press it wrong sides together, you don't have extra fabric bunched up in the curve. And you want to make sure you're not cutting into your stitching line. Okay, we're going to pull the fabrics out through the opening, and we're going to turn them wrong sides together and press. And again, I'm going to use that precision turning tool to poke out the corners and then push those seams out. Okay, I'm going to use my fingers to roll the seams so that they're wrong sides together, and then take the iron and give it a press. Okay, and you'll also press the opening toward the inside by 1/4 inch. And then I'm just going to go ahead and put some wonder clips on that opening for now. Okay, Okay, we're going to take this flap over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew just the sides and the bottom using a scant 1/4 of an inch seam. So that's just slightly less than a 1/4 of an inch. Okay, for any top stitching through thicker layers, I like to lengthen my stitch length. So my regular stitch length is 2.5 millimeters, and I'm going to lengthen to 3 millimeters just for this top stitching. Okay, so this step is for installing the twist lock if you're using that option. So twist locks generally come with several pieces. First, it's the locking portion, and twist locks vary in shape and size, so yours might look slightly different than mine, but the locking piece goes with the washer in general. The front of the twist lock has this smooth piece and also this other piece with the holes for the screws. Some twist locks come with prongs, but I prefer using the kind with screws, and then of course the 2 screws. You'll need a Phillips head screwdriver and some fabric glue. I'm using the Beacon 1 3-in-1 glue. Okay, so we're going to make a mark on the flap that's centered and 1 inch up from this bottom curved edge. And I'm just going to use my ruler to do that. Be really careful with those screws because they're so easy to lose. Okay. So I'm going to mark the center, and then I'm just going to verify that it's indeed centered. Move it over just a little bit. Okay. So you're going to take this portion of the twist lock with the 2 space for the screws. I'm going to lay the middle of the twist lock right on top of the marking that I made. And then I'm going to draw that inner circle as well as 2 dots for where the screws will go. And then I'm going to connect kind of with an inward facing V from where the screw hole is toward that center oval. And it kind of looks like an eyeball almost. Okay, I'm going to use my seam ripper to get an opening started. And then my scissors for the rest of the way. And you want to cut through both layers of fabric from the screw holes to the center. And start with cutting a small opening. You can always make it a little bit bigger. Okay, after cutting through both layers of the fabric, you want to lay this piece on the fabric to make sure you don't see fabric showing. And I see a little bit of fabric showing on the upper layer, so I'm just going to cut back a little more fabric. Okay, just like that. All right. So again, the smooth portion of the twist lock is going to be on the right side of the fabric. I'm going to flip to the lining side, and you also need to make sure that you can see the screw holes and that there's no fabric obstructing it. So I need to cut a little bit more from this side. The reason you don't want fabric obstructing the screws is that you'll have a really difficult time, or you might not even be able to get the screw to screw in. So we're going to check everything first before we go ahead and glue this in place. Okay, I can see both of the screw holes. I'm going to leave the flap in place right above this locking piece. And I'm just going to go ahead and put a bit of fabric glue on here. The reason for the fabric glue is that you don't want to install the twist lock and then see the raw edges of the fabric poking out, trying to poke out around the sides of the locking piece. Okay. All right. So I've got that piece glued in place. Again, make sure you pull back the fabric so that it's not near the screw holes. And then I'm going to follow up with this piece where the holes are. And again, we're going to add some more glue to the wrong side of this piece. And if you wish, you can also add some more glue to the screws before, well, the screw holes rather, before you screw them in place. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'm going to take that first screw and screw it in. Again, like I said, if you'd like to put a bit of glue in that channel before you screw it in place, that makes that screw for sure permanent. And then follow that up with the second screw. Okay, so that portion of the twist lock is complete, and that's what it looks like from the right side of the exterior fabric. Okay, now it's time to install the other portion of the twist lock. So go ahead and pull out one of your exterior main panels. This is the portion that's going to be the front of the bag. And you'll want to reference step number 13 in the pattern for marking for placement of this piece. So I'm making small. I'm going to measure 1 3/8 of an inch down and centered. If you're making size large, that'll be instead 3 inches down. Okay, and again, you want that marking to be centered. 1 3/8 of an inch down for small. Okay, so I'm making a mark, and again, I'm just going to verify that that's indeed in the center. Okay, so I'm going to use this locking piece to mark the prong placement. Again, I'm going to center that locking piece over the marking that I made, and I'm going to mark the prongs for the prong placement. Alternately, if you're using the magnetic snap instead, you'll do the same thing. It'll be the same measurement, and instead you'll mark the placement for the female half of the magnetic snap, and that's the one with sort of the opening. Okay, again, I'm going to take my seam ripper and make slits and follow that up with a bit of seam sealant. I'm also going to mark the prongs on a piece of Peltex. Okay, if you're using the traditional magnetic snap, you won't need the Peltex. The Peltex here is just for the locking piece. Okay, I'm going to insert that through the right side of the fabric. I'm going to flip to the wrong side of the fabric, slide the Peltex on there, and follow that up with the washer. Okay, I'm going to open those prongs of the washer inward, and then go ahead and fuse that little scrap of Shape Flex on the wrong side of the fabric. And again, if you're using the traditional magnetic snap, you won't have these two bits of interfacing. You'll just have your snap in the same location again as the locking piece. Okay, now go ahead and pull out the exterior main panel that does not have either the twist lock or the magnetic snap installed to it, and the flap. So we're going to be marking and reference step number 14 of where you should be marking. If you're making size large, you'll be marking 1.25 inches down from this straight section in the middle, and if you're making size small, you'll be measuring 1.5 inches down from the middle section, since this section sort of veers to the side. Okay, even though you're measuring from the center, you'll mark the line straight across, and I'm using Clover Choco to mark it. Okay, and then you're going to take out the flap piece, and the lining of the flap will be against the exterior main panel. So the section with the pins will be against your chalk marking that you just made. Okay, we're going to stitch 2 lines of stitching. The first line is going to be 1/4 inch away from this straight edge of the flap, and the second line will be 3/8 of an inch away from the edge of the flap. And again, you want to make sure the flap is centered, so just measure the sides to make sure that it is indeed centered. Okay, and I'm going to lengthen my stitch length. Again, my usual is 2.5 millimeters. I'm going to lengthen to 3 millimeters. And again, we're using a scant 1/4 of an inch here. And again, that second line will be 3/8 of an inch away from the straight edge. Okay, now we're going to make the tab. So if you're using cork or leather, you're just going to use some fabric glue or a washable glue stick to glue 2 of the tabs, wrong sides together. You'll repeat for the remaining pair and give that time to dry. If you're using cotton fabric, we're going to place the fabrics right sides together. And we're going to sew 3 edges. So both of the long edges and 1 short end, we're going to sew using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and leave 1 of the short edges unsewn. Okay, and I'm going to turn to my regular stitch length, and that's 2 millimeters. Okay, go ahead and clip the corners. So just cut them on a diagonal. And then since this is such a small piece, I'm going to use my fast turning tool to turn it right side out. So I'm going to insert the tube of the tool in between both layers of fabric and push it all the way to the end. And then I'm going to put this corkscrew side of the turning tool through the tube, and I'm going to twist it until that corkscrew comes out the other end. And then that corkscrew just pulls the fabric through the tube, so it makes turning fabrics really easy. And then I'm just going to unscrew it to get that corkscrew to come back out. And then I'm going to use that precision turning tool to poke out the corners. Okay, so I'm going to give this piece a press, and I'm also going to press the opening toward the inside by a 1/4 of an inch. Okay, regardless if you're using cork, leather, or cotton fabric, we're going to take this over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew the entire outer edge of the tab using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, and you repeat that same process so that you have 2 completed pairs of tabs. Okay, now we're going to do some marking on the tabs. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to mark 1 inch down from the top of the tab, and I'm going to use my chalk to make a mark. And I'm going to take the 1 inch rectangle and I'm going to slide it and then fold down at the line that I just made. So I'm going to flip to the wrong side. The other end, I'm going to bring that up to meet the first short end. And then I'm just going to put some wonder clips to hold that in place. And you'll repeat the same process for the second tab so that you have 2 of them. Okay, go ahead and pull out the piece of the bag with the flap attached to it. We're going to sew the tabs to the flap, but we're not going to sew to the body of the bag at all. So when it comes time to sew, you'll just push that fabric out of the way. Okay, we're going to measure in a 1/2 inch from the side of the flap and up a 1/2 inch, and same thing on this side, in a 1/2 inch and up a 1/2 inch. Okay, so I'm going to take my pen and make a dot where those two intersect, and then I'm also going to draw myself sort of a guide. So basically this is where the tab is going to be stitched down, right here, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. Okay, again, that's 1/2 inch in and a 1/2 inch up, and then I'm going to draw sort of a guide with chalk just to keep things even when I'm stitching in place. And you want the folded edges of the tab against the flap. All right, so just like this. Okay, we're going to stitch this in place, and I'll move the Wonder Clips so that you can see better. But we're going to stitch a line of stitching 1/4 inch up from the bottom edge of the tab, and we're also going to stitch a 1/2 inch down from the hardware. So we'll have 2 lines of stitching, and again, we're not sewing through the main panel at all. And if you'd like to attach a rivet, you'll attach the rivet at this time. Okay, now grab both of the exterior main panels and place them right sides together. We're going to use that center marking to align both of them, and we'll pin that in place first. And then after you have that center pinned, go ahead and pin the top corners first, and then the rest of the way. So we're going to sew the sides and the bottom, so the pinned edge, using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You're not going to sew on top of the flap at all. You'll be sewing right next to it. All right, so let's get this over to the sewing machine. Again, this is going to be a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, we're going to trim the seam about in half, so to about 1/4 inch, and there's no need to measure. You can just eyeball it, cut it approximately in half. Okay, and then we're going to cut little V's wherever there's a curve, so basically all the way around. And cut the V's about every 1/2 inch. Go ahead and cut the V's the rest of the way. And you'll repeat this same sewing process to attach both of the lining main panels. The only difference is that you'll use 5/8 inch seam allowance instead for attaching the lining. And you'll need to leave an opening on the bottom that's at least 5 inches. And again, same thing with the exterior. You'll trim that seam down in half and notch it, so you'll cut little V's every 1/2 inch in the lining as well. Okay, go ahead and turn the exterior right side out, and we're going to place the lining and the exterior right sides together. So the side in the lining with the pocket is going to go against the same side as the flap. So we're just going to stick the exterior inside the lining. And make sure the flap and the tabs are pushed down in between the layers. You don't want to leave that flap sticking out. Okay, you're going to align the darts as well as the side seams. And remember, because we pushed the darts of the exterior in toward the center and the darts of the lining out toward the side, the darts should be nesting, so you shouldn't have extra bulk over there. And go ahead and align those side seams as well. And if you wish, you can use your fingers to sort of push that seam open. All right, I'm going to pin the rest of the way around the top edge of the bag. Okay, we're going to sew that top edge of the bag using a 1/4 of an inch seam, and again, make sure you're not sewing near the flap or the tabs. Make sure those are pushed down inside the center of the bag. Okay, now let's pull that bag right side out through the opening in the lining. Okay, and then I'll push the lining down inside so that the fabrics are wrong sides together. And you can either press or finger press that top edge. Especially if you're using cork or leather, you'll want to finger press that. And I'm just going to put some Wonder Clips all the way around. We're going to top stitch this top edge and go ahead and push that flap out of the way using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So continue pinning, and then we'll take this over to the sewing machine and do some top stitching. Okay, and I'm also lengthening my stitch length, so I'm lengthening to 3 millimeters for this top stitching. And if you're using a different color of lining fabric, you may consider coordinating your bobbin thread to match your lining fabric so that both the top thread and the bottom thread blend in with the fabric. Okay, now go ahead and pull out your strap fabric, and we're going to press it along the short end toward the wrong side by 1/2 inch. So I'm going to draw a line that's 1/2 inch in, and I'm going to press toward the wrong side at that line. Okay, next we're going to press that strap wrong sides together in half. And you'll continue pressing the entire length of the strap all the way down. After you've done that, go ahead and open out the strap fabric, we're going to press the long edge in toward the center crease. And then we'll also press the top edge down toward the center crease. Again, you're going to go all the way down the entire length of the strap. And then after you've done that, go ahead and refold and then give it one more press. Okay, I'm going to place some Wonder Clips to hold the layers in place. And then I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew all the way around the entire outer edge of the strap using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. If you're using cork fabric instead, your fabric will be less wide, but instead you'll press it wrong sides together in half and then just put some Wonder Clips on. Either way, your strap should be 1 inch finished width. All right, so regardless of which type of material you're using, let's take this over to the sewing machine and again top stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric. Okay, and I lengthened my stitch length to 3 millimeters for this top stitching. Okay, press one short end of the strap toward the wrong side by 1 inch, and we're going to slide that through one of the metal rectangles. Okay, we're going to stitch this down 1/8 of an inch away from the short end of the strap and 1/4 of an inch away, so it'll have 2 lines of stitching. Okay, now it's time to attach that metal slider. So your slider might have a movable bar, or it might have a bar in the middle that doesn't move. Either one's fine. So on the right side of the strap, I'm going to go ahead and thread it over and under that middle bar and then pull it a little bit through. Okay, on the other end of the bag, again, this is the right side of the strap, I'm going to bring it through the front of the rectangle, just like that. And I'm going to flip it over so you can see the wrong side of the slider. So I'm going to move a little bit of fabric out of the way so that metal bar is free, and I'm going to slide this loose end of the strap, again, under and over that middle bar. And if you need to, just push more fabric out of the way. I'm going to bring maybe 1.5 inches or 2 inches of that end of the strap through, and we're going to stitch the strap to itself. So the portion where it came underneath the slider, we're going to sew that down. Again, we're going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from the end and also 1/4 of an inch away, and that will secure that adjustable strap. Okay, there's one thing left, and that is to close the opening in the lining. Okay, so I'm going to pull that lining out, and I'm going to press the opening in toward the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to place some Wonder Clips on that end. There's 2 ways that you can close that opening. You can either sew 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric and sew that by machine, or if you prefer, you can sew it the opening closed by hand using a slip stitch. So either method is fine, it's up to you. And then you're all finished. So give your bag a really good press and you're done. Thanks so much for sewing along with me. I can't wait to see your finished bag. Please post a photo of your finished project in my Facebook group. And remember, if I can do it, so can you.